Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gareth Sturdy. I am with the Education Forum of the Academy of Ideas. We're not talking about education this afternoon. We're talking about assisted dying on the NHS is the question before us. Suicide or its attempt is not actually a crime in England and Wales. However, it is a crime for a person to encourage or assist the suicide of another person, and that carries a potential maximum sentence of 14 years. And the Labour MP for Spen Valley, Kim Leadbeater, this week introduced into the House of Commons a private member's bill, the Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill, which would permit adults with 6 or less months to live to be provided with assistance to end their own life on request, subject to safeguards and protections. That's what we're here to discuss. That bill will have its second reading next month. So an ideal time to be talking about this. And to do so, we've got an absolutely excellent panel this afternoon. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. They're each going to speak for about 5 minutes just to introduce their themes, and then we will come straight out to you. We don't have an awful lot of time to discuss what is a huge topic. So let's go straight in to introduce our panel. Our first speaker is the Reverend Canon Rosie Harper, on the end of the table on my left here, Bishop's Advisor in Women's Ministry and Bishop's Chaplain. Rosie is a dual nationality Swiss, and she says she has a lifelong experience of a society where assisted dying is normal and campaigns to give that opportunity to people dying in the UK. At the opposite end of the table is Baroness Ilora Finley of Llandaff, who is president of the Chartered Society for Physiotherapy and a professor of palliative medicine, and co-editor of The Reality of Assisted Dying, Understanding the Issues. Next to speak, to my immediate right, is Dr. Piers Ben, a lecturer in philosophy and visiting research associate at Trinity College, Dublin. And his latest book, Intellectual Freedom and the Culture Wars, was published by Palgrave in 2020. And then last to speak on my left will be Professor Kevin Yuill, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Sunderland and the author of Assisted Suicide, The Liberal Humanist Case Against Legalisation. So as you can see, we've got an excellent panel to talk about this. Rosie, you'll start us off. 5 minutes, please.
Well, good afternoon. This festival is called the Battle of Ideas, the Battle of Ideas. And the assisted dying discourse over the past few days has most certainly felt like warfare. I want to argue that this need not be the case. When we use language like licensed state killing and slippery slope, we fail to grasp what this is really about. The battle, insofar as there is one, is between real embodied human beings and notional bad people who may or may not exist. So I would like to take you straight to the person who, in intellectual discussions, always gets neglected. This is the person who is dying. The person, let's give her a name, Louise, who is in such agony that she wants some help to shorten her dying. She has probably had a very long journey, some pretty foul treatments. She will have lurched between hope and despair. During this time, she will have had the support of local medics, GPs and consultants, a whole team of people who have been kind and supportive. They understand Louise. They have explained all sorts of options for treatment, some of which might lengthen life, but at a cost. In other words, they have delivered care. In response to the doctor saying, "There is nothing more we can do, we need to discuss what next," Louise says that she would like her much trusted doctor to write a prescription for medicine, which she would then take to bring her suffering to an end. She does not see that as the doctor killing her. She sees it as an extension of his care, an act of compassion and kindness for which she is profoundly grateful. This will be a very small number of people, but what gives us the right to stand by Louise's bed and tell her that she is wrong? Is it right that just because we are anxious about some imagined possible bad people, she has to suffer to the bitter end? It's logical for the doctor or team who knows the patient best to support them through this process. This is part of the known benefits of integrated care, which is well established across the NHS. And a departure from this at the end of life seems inappropriate, impractical, and unjustified. Those who suggest a separate service of dedicated assisted dying teams may be concerned about two things: the impact of assisted dying on the doctor-patient relationship, and the rights of doctors who oppose assisted dying and do not wish to participate. The right of doctors to conscientiously object to having any part in assisted dying will be protected by the legislation. Evidence from overseas shows that the relationship between the doctor and the patient is actually improved by legalising assisted dying. Clinicians describe their role in helping dying patients with their wishes as a privilege and the most meaningful part of their job. So I am suggesting that there is a quiet and gentle way of introducing assisted dying as one more part of the process of dying that we all have to encounter. Since there is now no drama around the subject, just lived experience, I asked my extended family in Switzerland about this. They said that even more important than having autonomy if pain and loss of dignity overwhelmed them, there was the relief from terror. My uncle managed his terminal diagnosis pretty well, but at 3 a.m, his thoughts turned very dark. Once he had signed up, the terror left him. It wasn't that he necessarily would, but that he could. Now, I know that there are risks that any freedom we give people can be exploited, but we have good examples of quality law both in Switzerland and Oregon which mitigate those risks. Some of you will dismiss what I say as too emotional. You are wrong. If you empty this discussion of emotion, you dehumanise it. What someone suffering in agony needs is the milk of human kindness, not a PhD in the subject. The call to introduce assisted dying is a call to kindness, and that kindness is deepened when surrounded by the NHS team who know you and care for you.
Thank you very much, Rosie. And I'm just going to ask if we could all thank our speakers at the end of their pieces rather than after each one. That would be great. Thank you. So, thank you, Rosie. We'll move on to Ilora. Ilora, perhaps you can contrast for us what Rosie's been talking about with the ideas behind palliative care.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. I've looked after thousands and thousands of dying patients over decades. And I love Rosie's completely idealised view. The question before you is, should this be on the NHS? No, the NHS is not continuity of care. It is fragmented. No, the NHS is not there all the time. It is on its knees and people are struggling. So what do you want the NHS to do? Hospice care is only 37% funded in this country. Yet people like Rosie want 100% ending life as part of the NHS provision. I think that's too dangerous. The law has to apply to everybody. Remember that the Australian evidence is that it takes about 60 hours of clinical time away from clinical provision to process one of these requests properly. I want the doctors and clinicians to carry on looking after people, even though they're already struggling. And who decides? What about these so-called safeguards? They're not safeguards, they're vague qualifying conditions. We can't define who's terminally ill. Many decades ago, I thought somebody had only about 3 months to live at most. He was desperate for help to end his life, and 3 of my consultant colleagues all felt the same. We were astonished when we discovered the various things that actually could have been changed and were changed. He is still alive today. I have had patients who I thought were dying, and I've met them in Marks and Spencer's. I met one lady in the bra department when I was buying a new bra, trying to get fitted. The reality is no doctor should ever say what Rosie said, there's nothing more we can do for you. There is always something more that can be done for people. It's just that the doctor may be too ignorant, too arrogant, too overworked, or too limited in their resources. Can we predict prognosis? No. There are diagnostic errors. About 20% of people at post-mortem have been found to have died from something different to what was written on the death certificate. Mental capacity. I'm afraid to say doctors are really bad at assessing mental capacity. They don't know what goes on behind closed doors in people's homes. We miss domestic abuse all the time. We miss coercive control all the time. The whole of my hospice has been taken in, staffed at every level, occasionally by families who we thought were loving families, until the person had died and the will emerged. And then we realised what was going on. And as for people being frightened, fear of being a burden, you can exacerbate those fears, or you can say, no, let's do something about it. The law has to apply to everybody. And you have to think, what do you want to happen? You've heard about Switzerland. Well, I'm afraid palliative care in Switzerland is now finally improving, decades later. It is improving everywhere in the world, but we know that in countries that have changed the law, those improvements are going more slowly than in countries that haven't. In those countries that have changed the law, apart from Switzerland, where it isn't part of the clinical service given, they've dropped in the rankings, the world rankings of quality of care at end of life. Is this the way to clear beds? I had a friend last Friday admitted to hospital with motor neurone disease. For 8 hours, he had nothing to eat or drink. Nothing was offered to him. At 4 a.m, a doctor came and asked him, would he sign a DNA CPR form? And he said, why? And they said, well, in case your heart stops. And he said, well, there's nothing wrong with my heart. I've got motor neurone disease. I'm afraid that's the reality of the pressures in the NHS today. Actually, he said he wanted to go home because he felt safer at home than he did in the hospital. And this is a hospital with a good reputation and a good rating. So I'd say to you too, this is not a Hollywood death. The drugs are a huge number. You have to take about a tumbler full, about 100 tablets to swallow or mixed in a sludge. If you're injected with the drugs, the Belgian mixture that they publish shows that 2/3 of patients are injected with a short-acting anaesthetic and then with something that stops them breathing, and they die of asphyxia. Nobody has looked to see if they regain consciousness before they die because they can't move a muscle. It's a mixture that's been abandoned in the USA for executions because it was deemed to be inhumane. So this isn't a Hollywood death. There are complications, and Oregon's being held up as a paragon of virtue. I just remind you, 9 people have reawakened in Oregon, and none of them went on to take a further overdose. And the time to death has expanded, not gone down. I'll finish there, but I'll tell you, 53 minutes to 137 hours to die when you've taken that amount of drugs, I don't call that peaceful and quick. I want every doctor, every nurse to have to do all they can to improve your quality of life and accept your death as a natural process when your life comes to a close.
Okay. Thanks very much. I am going to try and make sure we just thank all our speakers at the end of their pieces. But thank you, Ilora. So we've got the two very clearly different opinions on this subject. Piers, how do we go about trying to balance the harm against the individual with the moral harm of perhaps introducing assisted dying? How do we think our way through that?
Do you ask that question, or do you want to give my...
Give your talk, but that's the kind of issue that I think you might be able to help us with.
Well, possibly. Let's see. Can you all hear? Thanks very much. Okay, well, my position is a bit anomalous. I used to be a lecturer in medical ethics at Imperial College London. I teach moral philosophy generally now. And I'm going to begin with a platitude, but I shall try to defend the platitude. Obviously, there are very powerful arguments on both sides of this debate, just as there are with many other biomedical issues like abortion. Very powerful arguments. And I'm not saying that just for the sake of it, but it's true. Both sides can appeal to principles that in many areas of application are used by morally decent and intelligent people. Moreover, the debate has run for so long that well-informed proponents of either side, or if there are just two sides, are usually familiar with the arguments of the opposing side. I've been to many debates like this at this very festival. Usually comes up. I think most people, most good faith people, are aware of what the other side says. So most of those who favour the possibility of the permissibility of assisted dying typically will say that it can be, even if only rarely, the only way to relieve intolerable distress and fear, and that the person in such distress who hasn't got any other way to relieve it is entitled to ask for assistance from a doctor, and the person or the doctor asked is entitled to accept or refuse that request. That is often said. Now, those against often point to slippery slope arguments, and they're a can of worms in themselves. But some people will add, and I think this has to be brought out because it's often not mentioned because it's difficult to debate, that very often these slippery slope arguments are a kind of smokescreen for the moral conviction, hard to articulate in a secular society, that it is just absolutely morally wrong deliberately to take innocent human life, and that even when the motive is beneficent, such as in this case, it's just wrong to take an innocent human life, even if that person consents. That's a fundamental issue that probably we won't get to. People tend to stick to slippery slope arguments. So usually each side admits the prima facie strength of the other side, but here we get the disagreement. For some reason, each side of this thinks the weight of the argument comes down on their own side. Hence, there emerges a disagreement. But now, here's where it tends to go wrong. Or not so far, but often in debates I've witnessed. Each side now really needs to say why the considerations it adduces in its own favour outweigh the considerations adduced by the other side. Because we can all agree that there are people in terminal distress who would benefit from assisted dying. I mean, I'm using benefit controversially, but, whose distress will be alleviated by it. And we can all agree there are slippery slope concerns. Many people point to what's happened in Belgium and the Netherlands, for example, and what happens there. Not just when the law is abused, but when the law leads to the formation of new laws that are more permissible. That actually is something not mentioned, and reading that recently led me to think carefully about my own position, which had been quite pro before that. And then those against the bill don't deny there are cases of terminal suffering that can't be relieved by palliative care. So how do we go? Are we just going to say, this is how I feel, this is what seems more salient, or do we say it's actually irresolvable? I mean, I have to admit, I don't like sitting on the fence, but I do tend to on this debate. I tend to oscillate, I've flirted with both sides, but I am a fence sitter, I think. And I'd be grateful if maybe somebody in this room can topple me off that fence. Let's hope. But then what you can do as a philosopher, at least, is, very briefly, is just, to look at good and bad arguments. If, for example, you hear people saying, "Oh, the doctor's life is to save life, not to save, not to take it." Well, that's just question begging. The whole question we're asking is whether the doctor's life ought to be, on occasions, to take life, just very rare occasions. So that's rhetoric. We need to probe that. If we do slippery slope arguments, there was a debate on this in this room exactly a year ago, where we had to be clear about their structure. That 1 minute. Be clear about their structure. If you accept that there is something bad at the top of the slope where we are now, i.e. there are people in terminal suffering, incidentally, I know such a person. He's currently starving himself to death. He has Huntington's disease. He's going to get worse. He wants to die before he gets to advanced dementia. So there are terrible things where we are now. Now, the force of the slippery slope argument is to say, once we do something to alleviate those rare cases, we will end up doing more evil. There'll be involuntary euthanasia. You have to say, first of all, you have to talk about the likelihood of making a full descent by the slope, and you have to make a comparison between the evil at the top of the slope and the evil at the bottom. You have to do the thinking, in other words. We shouldn't be tear-eyed about it. I agree with what Rosie said in the first week. People are people. Emotions are appropriate in moral reasoning. It would be dreadful to be in a position of the person I know in that position, but I wait to be persuaded on either side. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Piers, for actually doing what I asked you to do, which was give us some principles of how we might balance these things. So very good. No, very good job. Thank you. Okay, Kevin, Piers has laid down a bit of a challenge there to a slippery slope argument. I wonder whether you're going to give us a slippery slope argument or what you're going to say, please.
Well, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to just look a little bit at the bill that's coming through that will be debated in Parliament on the 29th. And the second thing is I'm going to look at the evidence. So I will be covering what you've just been asking. So on the bill, even if I supported assisted suicide, and I don't, I wouldn't support this bill because there are a number of problems at the outset. We haven't seen it. It hasn't been presented to anybody. So people are supposed to look at this very momentous change and decide within a space of a few weeks. And I don't think that's an adequate time. I think even Kim Leadbeater, who's introducing the private member's bill, has said this is going to be momentous change. We need a little bit more time. And I'm surprised at the political ineptness of those who are bringing it in about that. In light of the state's handling of the infected blood scandal, Grenfell, the post office, Mid-Staffs and Gosport Hospital, and DNR notices on disabled people during COVID, is this a good idea? And I think the answer is that most people will come up is no, this really isn't. And second of all, one of the things that we've managed to do since I've been writing on this is polling. Now, a lot of the argument is that saying that, you know, from Rosie's side, is saying the majority of British people support this. And the polling that we've done, Ilora's organisation, LDW, Living and Dying Well, the polling that has been done there has shown that people are actually much more ambivalent about it. And that the majority of people, if you ask them, do you want a good death for yourself? People will, of course, say yes. But if you actually talk about the real ramifications, then people are much more ambivalent. 54% of those who answered the question when asked whether it should be legalized at all said they are in favor in principle, but don't think it can be practically organized within the NHS. So that's a majority of people who are at least ambivalent about it. This poll also showed that it's not a big priority for people. 22 out of 23 important priorities were tested, 23 issues were tested, and this the importance of assisted suicide came 22nd out of 23rd, ahead of only regional devolution, which I'm sure you will agree is one of the most boring topics ever. So 4% of people identified it as a priority. There is, if we're very honest, there's a hardcore on either side who are pro and against, and a lot of people in the middle. So my second point is really that I wouldn't support it anyway, because I don't think, given the evidence that we've had, when I was writing about this 30 years ago, we didn't have the evidence really to say what's happening. Now we do, and I think it's worth looking at. What it indicates, as my colleague Theo Bohr puts it, supply creates demand. If you offer medical treatment, if you offer this as medical treatment for suffering, then all who feel that they suffer will appeal for this, and that's been the case and is borne out by the evidence now. You can call it a slippery slope if you like, but there's real evidence that if you do that, it can't be denied to anybody. How can you? If it is medical treatment for suffering, how can you deny it to children? You know, that would be a fairly awful thing to do. And of course, that's what's happened. We've seen that Belgium has extended it to children in 2014. We've seen the Netherlands in 2023 expand it to children of all ages. And Canada is obviously on many people's minds about the rapid expansion that's happening there. Even Oregon has got rid of some of the safeguards it originally put in. Twice it's extended it. I can go through chapter and verse, but I haven't got the time because I've just got a yellow card. Yes, it starts out, and the other thing that I think is important to know, it starts out as a demand for those with money and education. We've seen this sort of celebrities, really asking for it at the moment as something. But we've seen in Canada that 58.1 made requests came from low socioeconomic status patients. Whereas 41.9 came from high status. So what we're seeing is that it's being used in Canada as a way of getting rid of people whose lives are very inconvenient to the rest of us.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we can thank our speakers. Okay, thank you. So, an interesting point from Kevin there, that even if you are a proponent of assisted dying, maybe this bill is not a good idea. And remember, we're looking this afternoon at whether assisted dying should be available on the NHS. That's something I want us to think about. So, we're going out to you. Now, what I'm going to do is take several questions. I wonder if we've got a cloth at the back or some tissue here. We've got a spilt glass. I wonder if one of our volunteers can help us.
Some kind lady's given us a tissue.
We have tissues.
Much.
Thank you very much. That's just to give you all time to think of some really good questions. I'm going to take questions in batches, and panel, don't feel you have to respond to every individual question. Pick out the themes and the issues that you particularly want to address. You won't be able to respond to everything. Okay, let me see hands. I can see a number already. Have we got microphones in this room? We haven't. We don't have microphones.
We have a universal.
We've got a small enough room we can all shout. Okay, I'm going to start at the front. I'm going to take this gentleman first and this gentleman first, and then I'm going to take you, madam. I'm going to take those three, and then I'm going to take the two guys at the back there. Okay, so we'll go with those five. So. It was you, sorry. Yes, it was indeed. Yes, forgive me.
It's the mic is there. I just pointed it at you.
Well, first things, thanks for mentioning the word disability, because it's often missed out in these conversations. 2 points. Firstly, I've never found the argument about two doctors persuasive, for the simple reason it'd be quite possible to imagine a couple of well-intentioned doctors just mentally turning a blind eye to the risks, out of genuine heartfelt conviction they're doing the right thing. So has there been any way of testing that their corners have not been cut? Because my suspicion is there would be. Secondly, it's more of a point, but I want to discuss it. My suspicion is that if there were a change in the law implemented, a debate or discussion of the type we're having now would be much harder in the future. And the reason for that is at that moment, the state's primary duty becomes less to protect the vulnerable, disabled, or seriously ill person than the doctors and families, because you only need one religious nutcase to go and take the law into their own hands. So they're going to have their primary concern will be to protect the NHS staff at that point who are implementing them. They don't want some sort of religious nut not attacking the quote serial killer. You see my point? Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, sir. And you, sir.
Hi there, George Gooding. Kevin knows this, but I'm clearing my calendar to contribute to this debate, and so thank you for a very rich conversation. I would like to make state three facts as it is, and say that actually the person in front of me that I want now is Sir Eric Pickles for various reasons on this debate. One in 6 people in this country have a disability, but 1 in 4 people who live in poverty also have a disability. So to your point, Kevin, if we look at who is bearing the brunt of health inequalities, has anyone who's read this, who's preparing this debate, ever heard of Sir Michael Mum? But connected to all of this, we also have it being projected that 1 in 3 local authorities are destined to go bust in the next few years. And if you look at the budget, of local authorities, the money goes on send specialist education and adult social care. The vast and I believe on average you're looking at about 60 to 70% of local authority budgets go on those two things. So what is being projected outside of a broken NHS, a care quality commission that's not fit to regulate services, according to this kind of Secretary of State. What is also being projected is that those systems that don't already work for disabled people are actually going to exist in the next few years. So the question I have is, for all the legitimate sides on either side, because we all want to die with dignity and in a way that we choose. How can we kind of stall this debate until such time that we have a system and a structure in place that actually supports those that are going to be most affected by this issue?
Okay, thank you very much for that contribution. And the lady behind.
Yes. While I understand and appreciate the arguments around the slippery slope, and we can look to Canada, we can look to the Netherlands and how that has been extended, the categories of suffering being extended. I very much appreciated Baroness Finley's arguments because I think we need to be looking much closer to home for the reasons why this is a very, very bad idea. We need to look at the NHS, we need to look at economic atrophy, we need to look at the fact that the NHS is rationing care. If you're over 65, you have dementia, you might have another comorbidity, you will be put on they give you a DNA and say that this is it, we can't do any more for you, therefore they put you on an end-of-life pathway and your treatment is withdrawn, your medications that were keeping you alive are withdrawn, your food and fluids are withdrawn, you're put on sedation. This is managed decline, and this is happening in the NHS right now. And during COVID, we had protocols that came in, NG163 and NG191. These protocols were basically the Liverpool Care Pathway rebranded. And the thing is, that has set precedents within the NHS, and this is really dangerous. I think assisted dying in this context is really dangerous. We also need to look at the protocolization of medicine, that doctors are not really relying on their own knowledge in making these decisions that are guided by protocols. This is also dangerous, as is de-skilling within the NHS and the arrival of PAs who are making decisions they should not be making.
Okay, thank you very much for that point. I just want to encourage so far we've had questions that seem to be in opposition to assisted dying. I do want to make sure that people who might be in favour of assisted dying are speaking up, and one of the chaps that I asked to speak anyway is about to make that point, I think. Sir.
Thank you. My point is about patient choice. And if I was diagnosed with a malignancy, a liver cancer, if I chose that I didn't want to have any chemotherapy, radiotherapy or surgery, if I was deemed not to be suffering from depression or anything else that affected my thinking, if I was given a mental capacity assessment, which is actually very simple, and if doctors can't do it, then
it's not simple at all.
He has a psychiatrist.
It's not simple.
Why shouldn't I be allowed to choose that?
Okay.
Presumably the panel members who don't believe in it don't take their cats and dogs and put down the vet either.
Sorry.
Interesting way of putting it, thank you. And there was a gentleman next to you. Yes, sir.
I've worked in care for nearly 2 decades now. The first 14 of those were supported adults with physical learning difficulties, although now I'm more on the admin side. Now, when I was in the care home and they needed a medical procedure, we did what's called a best interest meeting, where you get all the significant people in their lives, like family, support workers, manager of the home, the person Lucy, etc., and discuss whether this procedure will be effective in the person's best interest and take into account their thoughts and feelings of the person involved, because sometimes obviously they can't communicate and there may be lacking capacity, although that has to be established first, obviously. With this bill, I'm just wondering, if someone hasn't got the capacity to accept assisted dying or be given that choice, who decides basically whether they should go for that procedure or not? Is that stated in the bill at all?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that, so I'm hoping someone on the panel can answer that. Okay, I'm going to come back to the panel for the moment. We're going to start at my right-hand side. So, Baroness, would you like to respond to any of the points that were raised?
Fine. Thank you very much for all those points. I'll try and take them in order. the disability question is really important. There was a paper that came from Canada showing how you could have a serial killer in plain sight go undetected quite easily. It's in the public domain. I don't know how many of you have watched Liz Carr's film. If you haven't, do Better Off Dead ? It's on the iPlayer, but it's worth watching, and it's quite amusing as well. Actually, she's a brilliant comedian. George is absolutely right about poverty, and Canada calculated that they save $87 million when their rates were half what they are now. You've heard about the so-called slippery slope. I think it's incremental extension, actually. In every place that has legalised this, it's either extended in law one way or another, or it's extended in interpretation. And the numbers are not tiny. The Oregon data at the moment will give us about 3,000 assisted suicides a year in this country. The Canada or the Netherlands data would give us about 30,000 euthanasias in this country. This is not small numbers. This is a lot of deaths every day. As for patient choice, we should be giving all our patients choices in care. We should not have them being told you have to pee into pads because we haven't got someone to bring you a commode or to help you out of bed. We've got to get care at every level right. As for taking your dog to the vet, I would just remind you that 80% of animals are put down because of the cost of maintaining them or because they're no longer wanted. I've even known a vet tell me about a dog who tried to run out, but when the dog seemed to realise what was going to happen. But actually, has anybody asked the dog? Did they consent? We're not animals. We have conversations with our patients. As for mental capacity, I chaired the Mental Capacity Forum for 6 years for the Ministry of Justice, and I was actually quite horrified at how poorly my colleagues in medicine and other branches of healthcare understand the Mental Capacity Act and how to assess mental capacity properly, even people thinking a mini mental state was adequate. The Ontario data that came out 2 days ago, which has been alluded to, is really worrying, showing the number of people who are in poverty, who are socially disadvantaged for various reasons, and who've actually sought assisted death as a solution to their social problems because they don't see a way out, rather than them being medical problems, which is the point that was made from the front. I could
Ilora,
go on, but I'll give other people a chance.
Can I just clarify that point?
Yeah.
Are you saying that this that assisted dying, therefore, is a greater risk to minority communities?
I think you have to look, whenever you change the law, you have to say, on balance of harms, what is the safest? The law applies to everyone in the country. It has to protect people. Our laws are there to protect people at the most vulnerable time. The gentleman at the back said, if I, all I can tell you is of all the patients I've looked after, when the disaster happens, they think quite differently to the way that they thought that they would think beforehand. I've been there myself. I know what it feels like when your world suddenly feels as if it's falling apart. The thing that you always dreaded, you're being told is now happening. But actually the way that you respond is different, and you need support to know that you are still of value, that you are a person who still is of worth. I had a time... Can
I just move us on for the minute? Thank you very much.
Sure do.
Piers.
Thank you. What can I say in response to various points that come from the audience? I suppose the most powerful argument used by those who advocate this sort of change is that you can't just sacrifice even just one individual in internal distress for the greater good of the community. So what one can say, what I want to moot, is this, without wholly believing it, it is that I've little doubt that whatever the merits of palliative care, and I agree they are very great, and however much it's now been extended, the argument that says, oh, well, if you had assisted suicide, palliative care would shrink, therefore we shouldn't have assisted suicide, presupposes that if you... I've heard people say this, that presupposes that if you didn't allow people to assist suicide, there would be palliative care, and often there isn't. So take the person I happen to know who is he regards himself as forced to starve himself to death. He's not literally forced, but he's got Huntington's, already quite well advanced. He's going to starve himself to death to stop it getting even more advanced. What he would want is the ability to go to Switzerland without his wife risking prosecution for it, whether he's right to think that. But the point is, there are a few cases like this that really do distress me. And what worries me about the arguments one hears against this sort of bill, whatever their merits, is that they seem prepared to sacrifice a few individuals in great distress and fear for the good of the many. But I'm sure that's a general issue that we can discuss.
Thank you. Well, Kevin, can you take that point up, or any of the points that have come out? But I mean, that's a fair charge, isn't it? That in the name of greater principle, you are rejecting the suffering of particular individuals.
I don't think that's the way I would accept it as being characterized, not surprisingly. But I think when you're looking at suffering, I think Ilora makes a very good point that there is that cross this bridge when you come to it kind of idea. A lot of this entire discussion is built on fear. It's built on fear of a bad death, which I think is a rational fear in some ways. But it's not going, as Ilora says, it will change as you go through that particular experience. We will all die. Sorry to break that down for you, but we are all going to at some stage, and we can't imagine what our deaths will be like. And yet people are spending a lot of time sort of thinking about how that's going to go. And I think we need to move away from the abstract and really get on to the concrete when it comes to this, and cross this bridge when we come to it. Just the interesting discussion on suffering. I mean, the person at the back, I think, is interesting. Patient choice. Why shouldn't patients have a choice? In some ways, everybody does. Everybody has the ability to eventuate their own death, unaided. And it is entirely impossible. Even Tony Nicklinson, who you might remember from the news, was able to demand that any treatment and food and drink was stopped, and he died within 5 days. That's less than the cooling off period that's proposed under the last bill. I don't know what's going to happen in this bill. Nobody does yet. But I think we all have that ability already. And secondly, if you do have choice, then you have to have the question of who gets this choice. Mm-hmm. Because where do you draw it? Right now, it's an utterly random line to say 6 months to live, you get the choice. 7 months to live, you don't get the choice. And I think you really need to question why that line is being drawn right there. There is no particular reason for that I can see. There's no moral reason. And so you're dividing society between two different groups of people. You're saying to one group, we're going to prevent your suicides. We're going to take strenuous efforts to prevent your suicides. And then you go to the other group, you know what, we'll build a wheelchair ramp so that we can help you and we can give you a push off the precipice. And I think that's the real problem with choice, is that you either have to give it to everybody or to nobody.
I suppose that's part of this debate, that if it's a matter for the NHS, then perhaps that does extend that choice to more people. I don't know. You mentioned the Nicklinson case there as well. I mean, it's important to recognise that this question keeps coming back to Parliament. It keeps coming back to judicial reviews and High Court cases, and each time it's pushed back. It hasn't actually become law. So I don't know if that means that there's a gap between where maybe the judiciary or the legislators are and where the public is, or, Kevin was referring earlier to perhaps public opinion is not as behind this as we're led to believe. Rosie, I don't know if you want to respond to any of that or any of the questions that have come out, but please.
It's massive. I feel as if I've accumulated a whole load of stuff.
I think you have, yeah.
There are all sorts of different ways of approaching this, but what I primarily want to say is that this is not that. We have had a very intelligent conversation about the decline of the NHS. It's serious, it's dramatic. We've now got 30-year-old women with breast cancer being denied life-prolonging drugs because it's too expensive. We've got all sorts of difficult moral issues going on within the NHS. However, this is not that. So asking somebody, when you have moral agency, to respect your agency over your own body and give you some medicine which you yourself will take at a time of your choosing, is nothing to do with the catastrophic failure of the NHS. And to catastrophise that and to put it in some sort of mega scheme, I think is just completely crying wolf. This is a small thing which a very small number of people will choose to do, and they will do it with their own agency. I don't know how many of you read the Times this morning, but Melanie Reid wrote an excellent article. She's a tetraplegic, and after breaking her neck in a riding accident, she wrote a very good article supporting assisted dying. And she said, the fact that I'm disabled is irrelevant. In other words, as many other people say, it's patronising to disabled people to say they have not got moral agency and can't make up their own minds about it. A dignified death, she says, is a basic human right, and at the moment it's denied to anyone except the well-off. We look at the slippery slope and we look at what's going on in other countries. And I would like to say that we could look at lots of things that go on in other countries and say, oh, look at that, we won't want to go there. We are our own country. We can choose to have our own law. We can choose to have a law as they have in Switzerland, where in 2022 they actually tightened it to make doubly sure that people who were assisting anyone having an assisted death were absolutely clean from any material investment in that death. So there are ways in which we can do this, which are small and clean and honourable, and we don't have to invoke some sort of great Armageddon in order to have this conversation, because this is not that.
Okay, well, there's all sorts of things I want to talk about, but I shall now shut up and go back to you. So hands, please. Let me have a look. So we've got some at the front. So this person here, and then these two people here. And then you, sir, on the side, and I'll take a few more after that. Yes, over here.
Oh, right, yeah. I'm still waiting for the mic. Which isn't going to happen. I really appreciated the nuance that Piers brought to the discussion. I've moved a lot on this debate. I've talked a lot about it at this conference, and you know, I've provided or facilitated the provision of abortion services for 20 years or so, and for me, the most fundamentally important principle is that of moral autonomy, of making a decision about your own life. What distresses, or what both distresses me and intrigues me about this discussion is why it comes so much to the forefront now. And I think a lot of it has got to do with the absence of trust that we have in people around us, whether it's our doctors or whether it's the NHS or whether it's our families and friends actually to do what's best in our own interest. So I think there's a very big breakdown of trust. And I think there is an absolute compulsion in our modern society at the moment to have control and a kind of medical control over the things that are happening to us. And what's influenced me and made me feel quite sort of less confident about the autonomy of choice thing in relation to this is that, of course, what we all want is a good death. We don't know what that is going to be. And there is a kind of compulsion to say, how can I know? How can I have a framework which will make my kind of death certain? So it's a little bit like a kind of notion about birth, actually. We know it's going to happen, we know it's not going to be a pleasant experience, but it's very difficult for us to say, but we don't know how exactly it's going to happen, so we just have to go with it and trust the people around us. I'll time it, I'll pay the money, I'll have it by caesarean section at 10 o'clock. So that's it. It's kind of, what concerns me is the environment and all of the things that feed into the discussion more than the technicalities of it itself.
Thank you very much. We don't have time to really explore the sort of similarities and contrasts between the abortion debate and this debate, but there are all sorts of interesting questions there, but we just don't have time today to go into that. We had two people here. I wasn't sure if it were two of you or one.
Do you want to ask us both? Because I don't mind if you want to speak.
No, if you want to speak.
Just a quick one. I mean, I was originally a proponent of euthanasia, and then COVID came along and various personal experiences. I'm going to mention one famous name, Stephen Hawking, Professor Stephen Hawking. When he was 30 years old, 28, 30 years old, he was diagnosed with motor neuron disease and given 6 months to a year to live. And then he was still around. Was he when he died? 77, something like that. Now, if he would have been taken away from us by assisted dying, then the world wouldn't have obviously gained from his knowledge, would it? We wouldn't have benefited from that. Look how much we would have lost. But from a personal experience, a next door neighbour of mine in 2012 was taken into hospital with a chest infection. We all thought she was coming out. A few days later, she was dead. She was put on the Liverpool care plan.
Well, it's been banned now.
It was banned in 2013. So in 2012, she was put on the Liverpool care plan, and her family was actually coerced by the doctors to put her on the end of life plan. Now, and speaking to her daughters and her sons since, I honestly believe she'd still be alive today. She was only 67 when she was, and she was coerced in, just like the COVID vaccines. Yeah. The NHS, which is, it's a quango, it's run by NICE. NICE deny life-saving drugs from people. They're going to basically coerce people into assisted death. You can see what's happening, it's going to be politicised. Sorry, I'll open it to somebody else now.
Okay, did you want to pick up your own themes? Or?
Well, a little bit, but first of all, I'm against assisted dying on a matter of principle and moral principle, and I'm worried that the canon here is sort of so advocating assisted dying, and saying that it has something, but on the completely different topic. You're saying that it has nothing to do with our trust in NHS. I think it has a lot to do with our trust in NHS, because how can we have choice if we don't actually have a choice, because our palliative care is struggling. NHS, I don't have any faith in NHS. So we don't have actually a choice. So I think we all should be advocating first. I mean, I'm against in principle, as I said, but we should all be advocating first, having our services sorted out, and then maybe pick up this debate. It's here and now. I think it's not the time. And there are already some philosophical advocates can I mention Matthew Paris, who is saying that basically if you're old or disabled, you are spared to the society. So how can we not be coerced and bullied into assisted dying?
Okay, thank you very much. I suppose just to bring the other side in here for a moment, when we say this is not the time, or when some people say this is not the time, as I say, this is 2015, this came before Parliament, it's come back again since then on a couple of occasions. On one of those occasions, the debate just ran out because a general election happened. So in a way, this debate has been going on for quite some time. Anyway, we've got a gentleman here on the window ledge. Sir.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that it is very important that we do contextualise it within the fact of the NHS, and it's not simply just whipping up the storm, because as the other gentleman mentioned, the impact on palliative care, in fact, it can't really be a choice if we're not given all options, and we have such a failing NHS system. I also wanted to touch on, I think the gentleman mentioned on the bill, and sort of the mechanisms. I'm pretty sure the suggested mechanism is having two doctors approve it and then it going to the High Court. I was wondering how you think the mechanism would work, because the High Court, I watched a lecture on this, and I'm pretty sure if you extrapolate the amount of cases in Oregon, you would have I think 1,500 additional cases in the High Court, and whether they would actually be able to process all these cases, and also the fact whether having two doctors, whether you think having two doctors is enough in terms of approval, because additionally you have the whole idea of making that autonomous decision, and how would these doctors know that when you're at the end of your life, when you're really vulnerable, whether you actually are making a decision based on what you think rather than the college.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. I am going to take just a couple more questions and come back to the panel. We've got under 25 minutes now, so I'm going to insist that you make your points really quickly and neatly as you can so we can get most people in. So I'm going to take two more and then we're coming back to the panel and we're going to start with you, Rosie, this time. Gentleman here and then the lady behind.
So if a person's suffering is bad enough, they'll commit suicide anyway. They'll take matters into their own hand. Surely it's better for them to do it in a safe and controlled manner rather than having to find some way to do it themselves.
Perfect. Nice and succinct. That's exactly what I wanted. Everyone will think you're a plant now, but that was a really good question. Thank you. Madam.
So my mother-in-law had the cancer gene, and she had breast cancer, and she had liver cancer, and she had a couple of skin cancers as well. At the end of her life, I watched her rot, and for probably 8 months, she begged every day for somebody to put her to sleep. It wasn't something that she thought about as a rash decision. It wasn't something that she thought her palliative care was exceptional. They did everything that they could. She literally rotted away, held my hand and said, you know, let me go. And that choice was taken from her. The end was horrific.
Thank you very much for making your point and in such a clear way as well. Thank you. Rosie.
Thank you very much for that. I think I want to go back to my first point, which is we're talking about the reality of people's sufferings. We've been talking about notional this and notional that and the state of the institution and the state of the general public's trust. The general public mostly are actually all right at the moment. It's the person in the bed rotting away and begging to be allowed to die that we are standing at the end of their bed and saying, no, because of our sensitivities about this, that and the other, we are going to tell you in a paternalistic way, this is not going to be available for you. That, by the way, is the reason why I, from a position of faith, believe in the sort of God that is not the sort of God that stands at the end of the bed and says, I have a plan for your life, and my plan for your life is you've got another 2.5 weeks of this hell before I'm going to let you go. I believe in a God who is a loving God with a compassionate heart, and there's nothing more at that point that can be done for the person. And God is quite fine for you to say, I've had a wonderful gift of life, and I now hand it back to you. I don't believe in a command and control God. I don't believe in a patriarchy. I don't believe in a command and control society who tells individuals that they no longer, at the point when they most need it, are allowed to have autonomy over their own bodies.
Thank you. Kevin.
A couple of things. First of all, just to come back on something Rosie said earlier, that this is a small number of people that we're talking about. The evidence shows that it isn't. And it's worth looking at Canada and noting that in 2022, euthanasia was, and 99.9% of Canadian assisted deaths, as they're called, made, is actually euthanasia, where the doctor takes the final action. Assisted suicide is where you take the final action. It was the 5th biggest cause of death in Canada. It was ahead 4 times the suicide rate was euthanasia. So this is not, we're not talking about a small number of people. We're not talking about the sort of wealthy. It's filtered down. And for instance, the most recent example is, which was in the Telegraph, was of a woman, could be worse, which was of a woman who was about to have a mastectomy, and her doctor offered her assisted suicide, euthanasia, and said, and the problem is, I'm very worried about, I'm very sort of leery about these vulnerability arguments, but you're pretty vulnerable when your doctor is suggesting something. When I go to my doctor and the doctor suggests something, I tend to listen. And that is a real problem. So I think there is a sort of element of that. Just in relation to the technical question that the gentleman there asked about the 2 doctors, we don't know what the bill's going to hold because nobody's published it yet. They've published a title and that's it. But in the Falconer bill, it's 2 doctors who would have to approve it, and it was also it would also have to be sanctioned by the family law by a judge. And which is a really impractical kind of thing. I can't believe that will last for long. And if the judge does judge it, it will just be deferring to the doctor. There will be, what else is a judge going to do? They have enough cases going on there that they're not going to be able to spend a lot of time doing this. So that's, the idea. In terms of, somebody mentioned a safe suicide, which I always find a slightly ironic kind of concept. What's the worst that can happen? It is an odd kind of thing. But there's and I'd love to know what Rosie thinks of this. There's an invention by a gentleman who tried it out in Switzerland called the Sarco, whereby you can jump in yourself and do everything yourself. That's real autonomy. Then you're not having to involve a doctor or anything. And yet I find that pro-assisted dying groups tend to reject that. And in fact, he was prosecuted in Switzerland for using this. So not even the Swiss authorities think that this is any good. But if you're really in favor of autonomy and you are not horrified by this concept as I am, then the Sarco is perhaps the way to go.
Okay, thank you. Piers, you were saying that you were sort of somewhat on the fence on this issue. Is there any of this changing your opinion? Are you led in any one particular direction by what we're saying today?
I think empirical facts, which obviously you have to verify later about what's actually happening in the jurisdictions that have allowed this sort of thing, are relevant, and I think they are weighty. I haven't reached a conclusion exactly, but I just have a few comments on how the argument has gone, because that's what really interests me. I mean, the strongest impulse in me that goes against the idea of assisted suicide is actually the traditional one. You might couldn't call it religious, though I don't have a religious conviction myself. That is that if you deliberately take innocent human life, you are crossing a sacred threshold, whatever the reason is. Now, I know all the philosophical ways of trying to debunk that. You can read David Hume's essay of suicide, which makes fun of the idea. He says, well, if you're interfering with nature by killing yourself, then you're also interfering with nature by having medical treatment. We can do that sort of games. But I just want to, I'm not going to try and defend this, because they're very hard to defend. But I suspect I'm not alone in thinking that is the fundamental moral issue. And of course it applies to suicide without assistance. The Catholic Church says that suicide's a mortal sin. It doesn't mean everybody who commits suicide goes to hell, but the issue there is about mental competence. But if you are mentally competent and commit suicide, then in that religion you have committed a very serious sin. Now, obviously we could say against that, oh, I own my life. What's all this about not owning my life? Well, in a sense, maybe I do. But that's what I think is a difficult thing to discuss. When it comes to assisted suicide, of course, what the proponents usually say is, if it's morally permissible to take your own life, surely it must be permissible to ask someone to help you do so. Just as if you're physically disabled, imagine you have difficulty stirring the sugar in your tea because you have a tremor. The decent thing to do for somebody in that condition would be to help them stir the sugar. That's a decent thing to do. Why don't we say the same thing about people in terminal distress? Ilora mentioned, and others mentioned, ideas about how do you know the diagnosis is right? Well, that argument can be applied across the board. You could even use it as an argument against any medical treatment. I mean, the diagnosis might be wrong. There might be side effects we haven't predicted. Sure, there are always risks, always a bunch of risks. But then what's the risk of not? What's the risk of not doing these things? So, as to the idea that it's all supply-led, yes, I understand the idea about the assisted dying being led by supply, not demand. Of course, the same thing can be said about contraception, painkillers, all kinds of things. I mean, would there be such a demand for them if there wasn't supply? The question is the demand a reasonable one? And is the supply reasonable? It's not really settled by rhetorical concerns about, you're going to have supply. As to that machine, that Swiss machine of, what do you call it, that Kevin mentioned? Sarco. Yeah, of course, it's ghoulish, yes. And yeah, obviously having euthanasia as a kind of fashion thing, clearly there are worries about that. But if we're talking about rare cases of people who can't help themselves to die, who are in great fear or distress, or will be, asphyxiation, for example, then the compassionate side of me balks at that person being denied any sort of assistance. But that's what I remain on the fence, really. Thanks.
Thank you. Ilora, that point is crucial, isn't it? The compassionate side of one just doesn't want people to suffer, but I'm presuming you've got other things to say about how one approaches that situation.
If I can just remind you, the title of this was about this being on the NHS, and that's what we've been focusing on, okay? When you talk about tragic situations and bad care and things not happening, yes, I've seen bad care. I've been involved in rescuing people from situations of bad care where people thought things were completely hopeless. You talk about risk, Piers.
Yeah.
Well, the risk is that it's final when you're dead. You can make diagnostic errors, but you do have a chance to try to correct them. You might have drug reactions, but you might have a chance to correct them. And even Charlie Faulkner himself said, there will be cases where actually the wrong person's ended their life. You're talking about one person being involved in bringing about the life of another. With all the bills that I've ever seen, there's nothing stipulating the knowledge or experience of the two doctors. There's nothing stipulating the amount of care that must have been available to somebody before they're even considered. How the High Court will cope with this, I really don't know. We've got a backlog of criminal cases, rape cases, child care cases, and so on already. So I worry about that. As for suicides, I'm not going to talk about committing, because suicide is not a crime. People die by suicide. That is taking their own life. But please, let's get rid of this judgmental phrase. But we know from the countries that have changed the law, in Victoria and Australia, they were told that their suicide rate of unassisted suicides would drop by 1 a week. When they changed the law, actually the reverse happened, and they've created a culture of suicide across society, and the number of violent unassisted suicides has gone up by 1 a week. When you look at the suicide rates in those countries that have gone down, the legislatures that have gone down this road, the numbers are higher. We are expecting our doctors to undertake suicide prevention policies and try to prevent suicide. We know, those of us that have had patients, and the gentleman at the back I'm sure have the same, of people who attempted suicide, their attempt to end their lives failed, and later on they were really glad that they were still alive. I've got friends and colleagues and family members in that situation, that actually they were in absolute despair at the time that they tried to take their own lives. And in terms of choice, my last point I'd like to make is to have choice. You've got to have real information, accurate information, not be pressurised, not coerced. And on balance of harms, this seems too dangerous. I'm not passing judgment over any individual cases. Sadly, in life, there will always be tragedies. You only have to look at the news now to see the awful, awful things going on in the world. And you talked about the long-standing history. Well, I would just remind you that the history of this goes back to before the Second World War. And if you want to see a really convincing film used before the Second World War, look at Ich Klage An, which was about relieving people whose lives were not worth living of their lives. This is not a new debate. It's gone on for a long time.
Thank you. Just on that... On the issue you mentioned about the international experience, in preparing for this, I read that the select committee that did the work prior to the bill being formed was saying that wherever on the international stage legislation has been based on the terminally ill as opposed to the end of unbearable suffering, where it's been based around terminally ill, that it hasn't expanded and been applied to more and more people. But I don't know if that's right. When I read the situation, that didn't seem to be correct, which was sort of in line with what you were just saying. I don't know if anyone has anything to offer on that. Right, I'm going to take 5 minutes now of questions. They've got to be short and straightforward questions, nice and punchy ones, and then we'll come back to the panel for their very quick final thoughts on that. But please try and make your points nice and quick. So this gentleman hasn't spoken before. Yep.
Okay, I was a retired GP in a very small country practice. I used to describe myself as Dr. Finley with a laptop. I think this question comes up so many times that I always got a landing on Mars situation. We can debate whether you should land on Mars or not, but how you get there is another debate. What Rosie said, I absolutely agree with, and all the questions about palliative care, whether you get your mix, whether you put administrative sleep, completely irrelevant. I think these things are just red herrings there. The main thing is people who want the autonomy to die when they feel they want to die. I've been involved with a lot of patients who, if they could know that when the time came they'd had enough, they could end their life, they would actually be more confident to cope with the last few weeks and months of their life. It's like people giving up smoking. They don't keep a packet of fags there. Think, if I really get desperate, I can have a fag. And that sounds, a bit parochial, but that sort of thing, knowing that if things get bad, you have an option there. So they're distant points rather than questions.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to the back because you have spoken already, but if I've got time, I'll bring you back in. Gentleman at the back there.
Just as I come back to the GP, I'm an intensive care consultant. A lot of my patients die. I consider constellation death. I also would like to think I've got a good idea of what a good death is. I kind of agree in principle, morally, that people should have the right to decide when to die, but I think that some of this is putting the cart before the horse because palliative care has never been properly funded as a specialty within the NHS. And really, if you had a more comprehensive palliative care service, a lot of these issues around timing of death, the discussions around death, would be addressed in a way that might actually allay some of the concerns about your autonomy about and the mode of your death.
Thank you very much. Lady right at the back by the plant there.
I don't think everybody is afraid of dying, and some people think of it as a natural thing and an okay thing to do. Their fear is the pain of dying. I understand that the NHS probably doesn't need to do it, but certainly you can get private things where people who really want to die can just get it done and not have to worry about putting the burden on other people. So it's just the law that has to be changed that allows death to happen easily rather than NHS.
Thank you very much. And there was a gentleman here. Did you want to ask?
There's a couple of words that I think I'm slightly confused about, but I think that help inform my argument. The one idea of sacred life, I'm pro-abortion. I think you can fight defensive war and take life, but the taking of life we're talking about here is a bridge too far. And there is something irrational. I'm an atheist, but the actual point of the sanctity of human life, every life mattering, I think is something really hard on to. Because I don't believe that the argument about control is really about control. The Sarko machine, they don't want to allow people to have the Sarko machine. And I'm afraid to say that many people who are advocating for control for autonomy for patients don't support taking control over Brexit, support smoking bans, and don't have people. So I think control is a bogus argument. And what it means in practice, in the evidence we see from other countries, is that it would mean in a kind of pessimistic, not value human life, cost-cutting exercise, it would be a slippery slope.
Thank you very much. We got there. We finally managed to get Brexit into this issue. Well done. I'm seeing lots of hands from people who have spoken. I will try and bring you in, but I'm interested in people who haven't yet had the chance. There's another person on the windowsill there. Yeah.
I would like to bring up the moral aspect of this. So, kind of with this woman's point about, I want to extend a metaphor like Louise and this person's mother-in-law. I think we have to take into account what their what their point of view is at that moment. Because currently we're talking about the sanctity of life. But I think when you get closer to rotting away, I think at that point you start to see death as less and less evil, and the sanctity of life becomes more and more irrelevant in a way, because you only see death as a means to an end, as a means to ending your life. And then secondly,
can I stop you there, because I've just been given my 5-minute warning, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to. That was a really well-made point. Thank you. We're going to have hands down, I'm afraid, because I do want to bring the panel back for literally just a minute each. Just grab something there that was really important to you. Don't try to address everything. We're going to go in the same order that we started with. So, Rosie, if you'd like to respond to just maybe one or two things, 1 minute.
Okay, first of all, the idea that assisted dying, were you not to do it, would leave people still alive isn't true. Those people at the end of the process will be dead anyway, but they will have had a much more miserable death. So it's not as if, we're not going to do assisted dying, so everyone will still be alive. That is not the situation. They will still die, but more miserably. The other thing is the statistics. And statistics show that in areas where we have the same jurisdiction as being proposed here, particularly in Switzerland, it's between 0.4 and 1.4 of the annual mortality rates. So it's a very, very small number of people, but a much larger number of people get a huge amount of comfort by knowing that, were it necessary, it would be possible. And it changes the conversation that the whole community has about life and the conversation that patients have with their doctors about the end of their lives, and that is life enhancing.
Thank you very much. You've brought statistics. I'm sure Kevin will have a problem with those statistics, but I'm going to come to Ilora. Please, just 1 minute.
Thanks. Okay, well, I am actually Dr. Finley, and I've had open conversations with thousands of people over the years. You talk about Switzerland, but actually there it's not part of their healthcare system. So let's stick to the motion on the table, please. Quebec estimate 10% of their deaths are now by giving people lethal drugs. If somebody attempts suicide, then we are still looking after them. I had a lady who had attempted suicide, and we took her from intensive care actually over to the hospice. She eventually woke up. We didn't think that she would. But then she went on to say how she never realised how valuable life could be once we helped her sort out her problems. People are in despair. They need help. They need support. That's what we should be doing with our healthcare system, not having two doctors deciding arbitrarily whether somebody's life is worth them giving a lethal overdose to or not, because you're asking two doctors to be the gatekeeper. This isn't about the patient's choice. This is about who's the gatekeeper.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Just 1 moment, please. Piers.
Thank you. Well, I thank Ilora for reminding us that the motion is about the NHS, so I suppose one could take the resource allocation angle here. There's a debate about IVF on the NHS, maybe that people IVF is a lifestyle need and not a medical need. Same thing might be said of assisted dying. I can see how the case might be made, but I don't think it would be very plausible. I mean, what concerns me is that whatever people say about there being misdiagnoses and people being glad they didn't opt for assisted dying, all these things, there are always cases that point in a direction. There are always people who might be quite rightly or appropriately euthanized or allowed to commit suicide with the help of a doctor. We shouldn't just focus on one side, and that's what I really want to make in my opening speech. I recognise that both sides are of good faith in this debate. They've heard the other side very much. They understand what's said. What we need from each side is a direct answer to the other side in such a way that shows that their arguments are stronger. This is what you often don't find. You find it in all sorts of debates, like abortion, Brexit, all sorts of things. People say their thing, and they say, oh, yes, I hear what you say, but I'm still saying my thing. We want to know why. And I think that's where the debate needs to go. But there's so much to be said legally, empirically, philosophically, so I better just leave it there.
Thanks, Piers. I don't know if we've done that this morning or not. That's up to you this afternoon even. Kevin, 1 minute.
Finally, yes, pain is not in the top 5 reasons why Oregonians go for this. So I think it's a misplaced discussion about pain. It's existential pain that drives people in this direction. And my final point would be, I think the reason that I oppose it is because I think in general, our attitude towards suicide should be to prevent it. That if we see somebody standing at the top of the proverbial bridge, we should not offer them a push, but we should try and talk them down. And yes, there are situations, as that lady said, very, where there are suicides that are right. There are deaths that I think would, I have witnessed a death similar where somebody begged to die in the last week, and it would be, yes, for an atheist even a blessing. But that doesn't mean we change the law. That is what I oppose, and I think we need to keep our general perspective against suicide and not change the law in this instance.
Thank you very much. Just hold on 1 minute. I'm really pleased that there's so much applause in the room, but that is the end of our debate. But I just need to tell you, it's now lunchtime. You've got an hour and a quarter to have your lunch. We're encouraging you to have a look around the stalls in the ideas market. Please don't go yet because we haven't thanked our speakers. Please, thank you, everybody. Julia Hobbs-Warne, Frank Ferradi, Tamanda Harkness, they've got book signings now. Marco Vischer, Jeff Norcott, 4 Women Scotland have got book signings at 2:30. Refreshments for sale in the Bishop... Thank you, everybody. Thank you. For sale in the Bishop Partridge Hall on the first floor, and there are still a series of lunchtime bites debates starting in 15 minutes. Okay, it's been a really good debate. It's not been long enough, but thank you all very much. Please now thank our speakers.